Madam Koi Koi. Anita was the new student at Prestige Academy for young women in Lagos, Nigeria. Every school has its own social hierarchy, so she thought she might have a hard time fitting in and catching up. But this school was different. There was one top dog here, the history professor, Madam Chloe. Madam Chloe ruled with an iron fist. A rumor was that her fist had met with faces several times over the years. Students had not reported the physical abuse, but people had seen the bruises. Madam Chloe always dressed impeccably in expensive name brands, usually a skirt and a blouse, and always with her signature bright red stilettos. The sound of those heels smartly clipping down the hallways would quiet the student's body and even the administration alike. When she walked past, a chill filled the air. The students nicknamed her Madam Koi Koi because of the noise her heels made on the floor. One day, Anita stood at her locker across from Madam Chloe's classroom and saw a student, Tina, rushing out of the room. She was crying, her face mottled and swollen, though she tried to cover the damage done by Madam Chloe. Anita followed her into the bathroom, where a group of teens was already consoling her. Enough was enough. The faculty had repeatedly ignored their complaints. They wouldn't let that monster keep getting away with this. Anita and the four teens planned an attack on Madam Chloe. It would be swift and immediate, and Anita, thrilled at finally being included, agreed to teach her a lesson. That evening, Madam Chloe was locking up her classroom. The rest of the building was empty. She turned around and was amused to see the enraged group of students step out from the darkened hallway. Immediately, she began mocking Tina for running out earlier and not being able to handle some much needed discipline. That's it, until Tina took her softball bat and swung it into the side of Madam Chloe's skull. The teens paused, a bit shocked. It was one thing to plan something, another to see it done. But then Madam Chloe, while on the ground, dug her nails into Tina's calf muscle and bit into it, ripping into her flesh. Tina cried out and began hammering the bat on her back to get loose, and that's when the rest of them went crazy. All of them began striking Madam Chloe, everyone except Anita, who stood as a lookout. After several minutes, the mob backed up. Her face was mush, her body severely beaten, completely unrecognizable. If it wasn't for her red stilettos, you wouldn't have known who it was. Still fueled with adrenaline, they swiftly cleaned up and buried the remains in the woods. For the first time in a long time, all five teens slept like babies. Had they gone too far? Yes, definitely. But they did not feel much remorse for riding the world of their monster. The next few days were filled with inquiries from the police. What could have happened? Where had the professor been? But when some of the teens responsible began going missing themselves, the investigation took a more serious turn. Of the 5 teens complicit in the murder, 3 were missing. They had been on a field trip and simply vanished. Tina rushed into Anita's dorm, locking the door behind her. What was happening? Were they next? Was it possible Madam Chloe had survived? Of course not. It seemed ridiculous, as they had both placed pieces of her body into a grave in the woods. No one could have survived that. Maybe the others had experienced a bout of guilt and had simply run away. As they began to calm each other down, a faint noise began growing louder from the hallway outside. They ran to the door, pressed their ears against it, and listened. It suddenly stopped. Anita could hardly breathe. Tina nodded towards the floor, her lips trembling. Right outside was the silhouette of 2 legs. As they watched, the tip of a red stiletto peeked under the doorway. Their eyes widened. The door flew open with such force it blew them back to the floor, debris flying across the room, rubbing the dust from their eyes. Tina and Anita looked up to see a nightmare vision, Madam Koi Koi, holding the same bat that Tina had just weeks before, with her neck barely attached and her body patched back together. The professor limped steadily towards the screaming things and raised her weapon high. Their fear kept them frozen to the spot, as with one deliberate swing of the bat, the zombie-like monster cracked Tina's skull open. Blood splatter covered Anita as she whimpered and shook. The thing that had been Madame Chloe raised her bat again, this time humbling Anita's throat, almost crushing her windpipe. Both things, barely alive, stared into their attacker's face as she grinned, and then vanished into the thin air. Tina bled out quickly. Amazingly, Anita survived. Upon being rushed to the hospital and barely being able to speak, she did manage one word, a word she would repeat when asked about what had happened. It didn't take long for rumors to emerge. Most people think the story of Madame Koi Koi is made up, but if you listen in the halls of Prestige Academy late at night, you can hear the faint sound of her blood-red stilettos coming towards you. The end.